Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with my guest Amar Dhall, who is a psychotherapist and leadership researcher focused on what happens inside people when the pressure is on. He works at the intersection of leadership, psychology, trauma-informed practice and nervous system science, helping executives and leadership teams stay coherent in high-stakes moments. Amar is the founder of the Neuro-Somatic Leadership, a framework that treats leadership development as training state under load, so clarity, judgment and relational capacity remain available when it most matters. We discuss what happens when the pressure is on, how it affects us as leaders, and the consequences of both being able to handle pressure and for those who cannot. How that impacts themselves, how that impacts others, with examples and tips for leaders to better handle stress and lead with confidence through tough times with others. This episode is in aid of Save the Children International, to which we've made a donation as a thank you to Amar for joining us. Amar, thank you very much for joining me. Please introduce yourself and how you support leaders everywhere.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for having me on this podcast. To introduce myself, I am passionate about supporting powerful people to be good humans, and how I do that is by taking leaders on a journey of integrating body and mind, and doing that in a way that produces what I would call psychological maturity, and leading from that place and being well equipped to handle the power that comes with what it is to be good at what you do.
Great, I love that. So powerful people to be good humans. So you've clearly got we live in the world today and how it is. What do you see about our leadership around the world at political level at the moment, and what would happen if that changed?
Well, I think let's say it's wildly variable. And I think, if that changed, I guess change it's unstoppable, right? The idea that change is the only constant. What I would like to see is, more maturity. I think that we have leaders who pursue power and interpret a kind of biological determinism, right? The strongest, the fastest are the best. And where that completely falls down is how to get the best out of everyone, which is what we need if we're going to face complex problems as they emerge, such as those that you spoke about in your book around technology and AI and where the whole world is going. I think we need everyone to be able to contribute to the solution. And that would be the way that I would like to see leaders change.
Yeah, the world might be a better place, right? So, without getting into politics, I think we better avoid that right now. Let's get into leadership. And you talk about nervous system dysregulation. You talk about the micro signals that we're all kind of dealing with every day. So I'm interested to know how you identify those, particularly in ourselves as leaders and then in our team members, before that leads to poor decision making, conflict, etc. And can you give us some examples of that?
Absolutely. So I love the question, and what my truth is to this is that we're such a long way away from talking in terms of micro signals. I think we really need to learn the macro signals first, and what you spoke about, where you attune with yourself first, and with an understanding of that, it becomes possible to attune with others. And to make that less abstruse, 80% of the nerve fibers on the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the human body that goes really from the brainstem and all the way, snakes its way through the torso, 80% of those nerve fibers are afferent, which means they take signals from the body to the brain. So the process of learning to interpret signals is about learning to attune with the body as an antenna. And this is a really learnable skill. I'll just say one little piece on this, and then which is that there was a 2021 study by Cambridge University around interoception, which is what we're talking about. So being able to sense what's happening in the body, and our nervous systems do automatically in mammals sync up with one another. So this will be what happened whenever people come together, or why people feel good when they get with their favorite animal and they can give it a hug when they're upset. Uh, is that there is a physiological aspect to this, and the converse is true. So that study by Cambridge University looked at interoceptive awareness, so which is really significantly determined by this vagus nerve. As I said, 80% of the fibers which point to the brain. And what they found, they looked at share traders, and because that's high pressure, big consequences, and they found a proportional relationship between longevity and profitability in that discipline. So really learning to how to interpret the signals that your body gives. And there's a vocabulary to this. This is something that should be taught in schools, but sadly isn't. Um, so I would say leaders learning first to interpret those signals with a specific vocabulary, then become really well equipped to understand how that works in other people, and then guide the relational system in a good way.
Yeah, I understand that. And some of the terms there I'm not familiar with, although I understand it. I really understand the fact that it's not just psychological, it's physiological because we feel this as much as anything. So maybe let's go a little bit deeper into this. So I find it interesting when so many leaders these days are under constant change. It leads to different pressures, etc. So what actually happens to leaders stroke people who are under pressure, i.e., their perceptions, decision makings, relationships, conflicts, whatever. What happens in real time in those pressured situations?
Fantastic. And just to go back to the first thing that you said, which is that we're living in particularly uncertain times now, politically, and the effect this is going. I mean, in Australia, there's a huge conversation around the cost of fuel. And by the time this airs, this may well be resolved and we may know how this looks. But today, as we're having this conversation, this is certainly alive, and businesses everywhere are struggling to work out what this means. So there's that type of pressure, and then there's the ordinary pressure. So when anyone is subject, or when leaders are subject to pressure and the responsibility that they have, which includes the need to potentially be a safe harbor in a storm for their people, they are experiencing stress. That stress is something they may not be able to embody fully. And what happens at a physiological level, firstly, is then a split between who we are and what's going on authentically and the way that we present ourselves. And that's necessary. But in that gap is where traumatic stress lives. So there could be long-term consequences or medium to long-term consequences that emerge from that. And specifically in the short term, what we're talking about is with low levels, there will be activation. It might be energizing when there's stress, and people might hone themselves to a razor's edge with their attention. And if that stress continues to build, then it collapses into binary thinking, right and wrong, my way or the highway. There can be an emphasis on outcome, and really thinking a lot about outcome regardless of the cost. And as that rolls on, it will then lead to, at that level is where we'll find anxiety, maybe quick temper, or a mercurial nature. And then also with that will come potentially some unhealthy behaviors around how stress is managed, as well as the switching off, the gradual switching off of the social engagement system, which means then they're going to be missing cues in their team. Their relationships everywhere are going to degrade in their quality. And if that still continues to rise, and that the kind of self-correcting mechanisms of the nervous system aren't able to cope with the amount of pressure, then we begin to go into overwhelm, collapse, disengagement, chaos, confusion that would come with that way of being. And then we'll get other health consequences that'll emerge.
Yeah, I can almost, as you're talking, Amar, I can almost see the graph and the relationship between the amount of pressure and the quality of decisions or activity, depending on how intense that gets. And that leads to an obvious question then, how do the best leaders handle that pressure and have the ability to take a step back, but then come back in a different way? And what's the cost for those leaders and their teams that can't do that?
Okay, great question. So one of the areas that I'm really interested in is, flow and burnout, because they're really two sides of the one coin. So leaders who know how to handle stress well, I would frame stress or as being really well analogized, or our ability to cope with stress as metabolic, in the sense that we metabolize our experience, and this is a quintessentially human thing to do. Traumatic stress is when we can't metabolize the stress that we have, and that's, you could think of that as indigestion in that same metaphor. So good leaders understand what it is. They what I would call burn their wood. So they have or they have a web of support around them, which may be a good emotionally intelligent coach. I mean, the first domain of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, and then the second is self-management, right? The first of the four domains. So good leaders don't just understand this cognitively. And what I'll also say is the more stress someone has, the more they will tend to over-identify with their thoughts, right? The actual words that are happening in their brain. So the if you think of stress and the embodiment of stress, like to be analogized to our body being water and the amount of stress being salt, right? And so if someone really lives in their head, then the volume of water they have is like a cup, and they're going to have, if you put 3 or 4 tablespoons of salt, they won't dissolve. If they have a bucket, you may be making brine with that same amount of salt. And if they've got a swimming pool, it's going to be a very low level of salinity. You may not even taste it. So how this works, or why I use this metaphor, is what happens to the body under stress is people will feel tension in their shoulders. People will begin to become more rigid. That is a mechanical lock that stops emotion from spreading into the larger container of the body. So, one thing that leaders are going to do that systemically approach this is learn how to embody emotion and how to allow it to have a big container. Um, that's potentially a little that's a longer project. At a really simple level, what they do is they become recovery experts and understand that to live in a high stress environment, the equally important other side is, how do I put energy into myself? And so one CEO I work with, his ideal prescription is to go surfing for 3 hours per week. And that is literally a way. It's not just me saying go and have a good time. That is his highest flow activity. It's how he connects with himself. It's how he gets to experience his body. It's how he gets to use his body, and it actually performs a really important physiological function. So whatever it is that puts energy in, learning how to embody emotion, and doing something that engages your highest flow pastime, whatever that is. All of those would be useful. So people who learn that are really good. Do you want to pause there so we can talk about that, or do you want to talk about the people who don't learn that? Okay, I can. So I also think we could say now that people say traumatized people traumatize people, and I think we could equally say happy people support happiness, or fulfilled people support fulfillment. And so I think the leaders that treat themselves as holistic beings are going to be able to create a more holistic team. I think the people who don't do this work, what I see is they become reactive. They will be pessimistic. They will be resistant to change. They will be rigid. Like, again, if we think of our consciousness, or the way that we approach things, as an animal, it's like the difference between a panther moving across uneven terrain, or someone on stilts having a crack at it. And so that rigidity, I think, is really what we're looking at. And then the other things that we talked about, being short-tempered, being inflexible, my way or the highway, and then from there, other coping mechanisms might come in, and that this then will affect culture as well.
Oh yeah, I can understand the knock-on effects of this. I'm sure we've all had leaders like this that we've worked for, but also from the flip side, we've got leaders who are pretty good at this, so they don't succumb to distress, if you like. They use stress, the positive side of stress, to
Hmm.
then understand, and rather than recover from what they've been through, prevent what they think they're going to go through as well, or what might happen in a situation. So of the best leaders that you've worked with, Amar, what are the traits that they display that maybe others don't, where they can control the stress for themselves and for others, so actually it can be much more focused on getting through that more successfully?
That's a great question. So I'd say some of the things that they do, many of them are an orientation. So one is they are open to always seeing what is their part in a situation. They don't externalize responsibility. And that creates in itself a really in order to even do that, they have to have a particular relationship with shame. Like it was for some high performers, like really high performers, they may equate not getting the right outcome with personal failure, right? If they can't achieve a KPI, then this is a personal failure. And there's space for holding oneself to a high standard and taking pride in what we do. But when that's unhealthy, and so what I'm getting at is the very essence of what motivates them to be what they are. I think that is something that they really examine quite deeply. So they don't externalize blame. They are curious about how they can learn from situations. So they've got that growth mindset. Um, and I think also they humanize themselves and one another in a way, or everyone in a way that isn't unprofessional, and know how to work and hold with the whole human being.
Yeah, and that link to leaving your ego at the door for some leaders, which is quite hard to do, is is where you start on that path of learning, because you realize, you know what, I don't know all the answers. I need to embrace that. I need to demonstrate for others that there's some unknowns here, and demonstrate that human side. In the era that we're in right now, the human touch, I would have to concur with you, is one of the most important traits. How do the best leaders impact their people in this way, Amar?
That's a great question. You said something so interesting. I just want to go back to it, where you talked about leaving their ego at the door.
Hmm.
And I would love to reframe that, or maybe just
Yeah.
tweak that and play with that a little, because I think the idea, like one of the things that I hear most commonly when I work with leaders, or they grow with me and I coach them and train them, or their organizations, is they say that they feel treated like a human being rather than a cog in a machine. Now, why this relates to the ego is I think that if we look at people who are now in senior positions of leadership, they're going to be, we're kind of looking at Gen X's time to step into these roles, right? So there's a there's an age component to this. So let's say around about mid 40s to mid 50s and maybe a little bit older, but this is now where people are in positions of senior leadership. So in the lineage of thinking that I have, there's a really natural part of life, which is the first part of life is to build your ego, to be shaped in response to the influences you had, your parents, school, your job, your workplace. And then there's the middle passage, which is where many of the leaders are now in. And they have a T junction. They can either double down and continue to build their ego, or they begin to de-identify with their ego. And so because we need an ego, we need, and I think ego isn't a dirty word, but when I'm narcissistic, when I'm controlling, like I think the way if leaders get addicted to power, and this goes back to what you said earlier about the current political landscape in which we inhabit, when there's a detachment from the way I wield that power and I want more power, then that is an ego running amok. But the alternative is to de-identify with it, which is a process. This is what I would call psychological maturity for people who would be at that stage of life. And when that happens, they get to reintegrate this work persona that's, gotten them to be in a position of leadership. So it works and what they do works and they're technically, good enough to be here or at this altitude. And a re-examination of what it is to be human at this stage of life then translates into the way that they lead. So I just felt that it's such an important point because and it deserved a little bit more airtime because I think the idea that with a good leader is humble, not weak. And humility is something that's cultivated. It doesn't magically fall out of the sky. And it's more than lip service. Like true, to be full, to be power filled and be able to serve from that place genuinely is the kind of human that creates teams that are tremendously loyal and do great things. So I just felt that I wanted to give a little bit more because it was just such a great point that you raised.
Well, and also you make the point right. We all have those egos, and in my flippant way of talking about it, then it was more that narcissistic, pride-driven ego that still some legacy leaders seem to carry with them and can't let that guard down. They're almost wearing a mask. So you can't get through that to the authentic selves in a time where there's so much change. We need to help each other so much as well. That goes as much as the top as it does right through the organization, and many leaders do need that help. Um, what are some of the
Absolutely.
best? What
Absolutely.
are some
And
of the?
just on that,
Yeah,
no, well, I was going to say that authenticity that you put your finger on is precisely how leaders are going to connect with younger generations that are coming through because they've been raised to have a different level of literacy within themselves. And it's a group that I get contacted by that are people in the definitely in the last quarter of their career in leadership and go, I don't know how to manage young people. And it's so this what I try and teach them is it's actually not about learning how to deal with the younger generation. It's about unlearning the things that you thought you needed to be to lead. And that is actually going to magnetize a younger team because that authenticity is much more what they resonate with.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, leads really quite nicely to I'm sure those tuning in and listening to this say, right, I really get this. Either I work for leaders like that or I'm in danger of turning into, a leader that's a little bit more resistant, or I can build on the progress I've already made. So, based on your research, Amar, your work with leaders everywhere, what would be three small, impactful actions that leaders can take to help themselves and in turn help others?
Yep. Okay. I'm going to give you the three, and I'm going to say, uh, as a categorical statement, I don't like to do this generally because there are no shortcuts to quality. Um, and I want to, and so I totally accept your question, and I am going to say some stuff, but I would like to give your listeners the service of saying that there is something to be said for doing something slowly and properly and risking oneself in that enterprise. And that is very much the way that I like to do things with leaders. And so that being said, I would say if there's three little things that I would invite leaders to do, particularly in this time, one of the things that I've found from the research that I've done is that, and this is the other side. Like I spoke about leaders at a physiological level. One thing that leaders can often do now is actually overfunction and start to try and take on more work and pick up the slack and lead from the front. So I would invite leaders not to do that. That would be one of the single biggest things that they could do to not burn out, to not become embittered, to be available and to stay open to their teams. Um, Another thing that I would say is instead of thinking about what you need to do, transition to who you want to be. and take responsibility for that, because I think once people get to a level of leadership, who you are is more important than what you know, right? Not early on in a career, but once you get to a certain point, that is what's going to invite loyalty. It's what's going to invite meaning. It's what's going to create succession and make the world a much nicer place and make your organization a much nicer place to be with. So these are little doesn't mean easy. It just means there's a little adjustment, instead of focusing on what I need to do, who am I as a person? Um, and the third thing that I would say I would invite them to do is to become a recovery expert for themselves and really see what is it that I need to function well. And then the second part, the obligation part of that is then when I view my team and the people for whom I'm responsible through that lens, how might I be able to bring culture and do accountability in a way where we're moving forward? And so we're not sacrificing. This isn't saying be soft on performance. What I'm saying is actually the highest type of performance that will be delivered sustainably will come from me not being burnt out or being embittered, and me really having uh, a sustainable attitude for myself and supporting that in others.
Well, I'm beginning to understand exactly what you said. This is not just about three small actions. This goes right back to the fact that sometimes we've just got to slow down, be prepared to learn more, recover, and then speed up, maybe bringing others along with us. And because I completely agree with the adage there, who you are, it's about who you are, not about what you know. As you are more experienced leaders, I understand that myself as a leader, but I work with leaders who don't get that. And the the the, the perceptions are kind of just so different on both sides of those spectrums. And it's just it amazes me sometimes that some leaders can't see this. How do you shift mindset in this way, Amar, for leaders say, you know what, you're right, I've really got to think about this in a bit more detail.
Well, I think this is a process, right? And that's then we're getting into the work in a really um, I think this is a path made by walking, and it comes back to what we were saying earlier, right? The question isn't or it's the pivot from climbing mountains, which is what got me to become a leader, is my ability as a mountain climber to reach an altitude, and then to be a good leader is what is it to live at altitude? And so it is a fundamental paradigm shift, and I think that one point is why people who are technically brilliant and get promoted into leadership fail in leadership roles, is they haven't realized or they weren't trained to make that pivot, right? It's a totally different skill set. I need to think about shelter. I need to think about how I'm going to support other people to climb. I need to build steps and all the things that are required. I need to think about water. Well, if I'm a mountain climber, I've got everything on my back, and my job is to simply climb as high as possible. So I would say that it is, how that changes. The other part is the bill will always come due, right? Like there's no point trying to break a wall down with my head. If a leader, if I'm asked to work with a leader and they are rigidly focused and determined in the idea that the problem is their team and they have no part in that, then I would label them as uncoachable, and I would, I can't help them. So I think there has to be the humility and the willingness to see, and this is, quantum mechanical principle, the observer effect. If I'm in a system, I have to include myself in the effect that I have, and that necessarily requires me to look at myself. And then I'd invite them to read something like anything, because the data really supports what we're saying. There isn't really much data to support them doing business as usual. So I'd say listen to a podcast or read a book and look at the status of your own relationships, because if you do this, if you function like this here, it's unlikely that you're going to be really fulfilled and flying in all the other parts of your life. So, I think the bill will come to you. I think inevitably people are going to find their way to your podcast and the kinds of people you get on and the kinds of ideas you espouse, because that's where the data is.
Yeah, it's where the data is. It's people like you, Amar, who come on here. You've got your feet firmly on the ground as well. So it's all very well for leaders to have their eyes to the sky and be looking ahead. But if you can't connect in the present, feel what's happening within the organization and feel your people as much as yourself in ways that you're describing, then it's going to be a much more difficult journey to, as you say, live at that altitude in the same way that you might have done even just 5 years ago. You need to adapt and change and move forward. Well, if those listening are anything like me, they've got a full page or so of notes, which I've learned from. So, Amar, for those of you out there wanting more, how do they find out more about how you can help and connect with you to continue the discussion?
Fantastic. Thank you. Through LinkedIn or through my website, which is amardhall.com. And there they can learn. I've got a 6-month training that I do with leaders that are all over the world, and we can have a chat.
Fantastic. Well, look, I've really enjoyed the discussion. Lots of things that I think I will be referring back to when I'm talking to some of the leaders that I work with as well, which I've starred and underlined on mine. And I'd just like to say thank you, Amar, for joining me.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a real pleasure to get to spend some time with you and talk about what are really important ideas, right? Like, this is how we maybe make the world a bit better. So thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please like, comment and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.